Lewis, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andres. It is a real pleasure for me to be back here, and in part because I was a student here, in part also because I'm half British, half Dutch. My mother is English, my dad's Dutch, and I was born in Belgium. So a little bit of everything. And the reason I sound like an American is because my wife is American and I picked up her accent. After 29 years, you know, these kind of things happen. So today I want to talk a little bit about urbanization and talk about the many difficulties we've faced trying to understand this in a harmonized global manner. And I'll show you some of what I would argue are flawed conclusions and policies that we've used to try and change urbanization or use urbanization to our advantage. So first of all, why can't we just simply use national definitions? National definitions, typically they have at least a dichotomy, like this is urban, this is rural. But what most countries actually do is they don't have a definition. They just say, well, these places are urban and these are rural, and basta, right? So if you're a small country and you only have really one city to speak of, maybe that's not such a bad approach. It's very hard to replicate this somewhere else, you know. So how do you know what they mean when they say urban is the same as what another country does? If you look at the statistical definitions that are out there, many use spatial units with very different shapes and sizes. So they might use municipalities or census tracts. Some of those can be very, very small. Some of those can be massive. And that generates a well-known distortion called the modifiable areal unit problem, MAUP. They use different indicators to define urbanization. They use different thresholds. And they also have a different spatial concept in their mind. They might think of the city center. They might think of the city plus the suburbs, the agglomeration. They might think of the city plus the commuting zone, what you call a metropolitan area. So all these differences are hidden under what each country calls urban. The most difficult part is that some include indicators on, say, for example, economic structure. In India, if too much of your employed population works in agriculture, you're not allowed to be urban. Doesn't matter if 500,000 people live there, you're rural because you're working in agriculture. If you don't have a hospital in Tunisia, they were like, well, you can't be a city if you don't have a hospital. But the difficulty with that is, if you then want to know how many cities in Tunisia have a hospital, it's easy to answer that question, right? All of them, by definition. So all of a sudden it becomes impossible to monitor access to services because it's already stuck inside your definition. And the same is true for economic structure. If you look at how many people work in agriculture in cities or how many people work in agriculture in rural areas, you get the wrong answer because it's part of the definition. So that's why we want to take those things out. And especially if you use, say, access to services, like in the example of Tunisia, you could become more urban simply by building a hospital. Not a single person would have to move. All of a sudden, that settlement would become urban, just because all of a sudden has a hospital. Well, what we're trying to do is define really urbanization as a spatial concentration of population. And the only way urbanization can change is by a change in that spatial concentration. So in 2016, at the Habitat 3 conference in Quito, we came together and said, okay, these national definitions might be very useful for policies, for national debates, but for global comparisons, they're really problematic. Everybody agreed on that, but it was very difficult to find something that people would agree around, to get a consensus. So we had 6 international organizations: European Commission, FAO, ILO, International Labour Organization, OECD, UN Habitat, and the World Bank. And the 6 of us sat together and said, okay, we're going to try and come up with something that we can use in Africa, in Asia, in Europe, in the Americas. And it took a lot of work. We consulted over 100 countries. But by the end of 2019, we had a method, I'll briefly describe it, that people liked. And we showed them our estimated results, and they said, oh yeah, these are our cities. Oh yeah, those are definitely our rural areas. So People were supportive. And then the UN Statistical Commission in 2020 said, okay, we're going to endorse this for international comparisons. So far, so good. But they gave us a little bit of homework. They said, would you come back and report on implementation? So that they know how many countries have actually applied this definition. They didn't want it to be just a methodology that was not used. They really wanted to see more countries use it. So that's what we've been spending a lot of our time on since then, helping places like Kenya or Tunisia or Chile apply this definition, Nepal, Indonesia, also talking to Japan and China. So really a very large number of countries, US, Canada, and this is their endorsement. So we wanted it to be a population-based definitions. Some researchers, including some here at LSE, use a definition of urban based on buildings. And I dislike that because buildings don't represent the same number of people in different countries, not even within the country. So we want to capture the concentration of people, not the concentration of buildings. We want to capture a single dimension, the spatial concentration of people, not looking at economic structure, for example. And it's not a normative definition. Some people complained about the definition, said, oh, but the density is way too low. These are going to be sprawling cities. And we said, well, we're not trying to define a city as it should be. We're trying to capture cities as they are today. Neutral, not normative, not, this is what the ideal city looks like. And mostly we wanted to get away from the black and white, not urban or rural. We wanted something more continuous, not a binary classification. So that's really what we started to focus on. And lastly, the really key point is we want to make sure that you can compare across time and across space. So you can compare one country with another. There are quite a few definitions out there that are relative. And so whenever you apply them to one country and you apply them again years later, it uses different thresholds. Or if you apply it to one country and another country, it uses different thresholds in the different countries. And I would argue that makes it very difficult to compare the results because they might change because the thresholds change or because urbanization underlying it changed. So this is the manual. We've translated it also into French and Spanish. There's lots of free data and tools and training available that explains exactly how you need to do it. So some countries like Korea actually applied this completely independently, didn't need any explanation whatsoever. And so let me talk about a few of the benefits. There were a lot of people convinced that you couldn't define urbanization with a single threshold. You said it's not possible. And I argue one of the problems was that they used municipalities. And here, you can see it. This is a map of the Netherlands, and these are municipalities, and we show the population density of those municipalities. And here's the same area, and we show population density of grid cells. Here you can see two little settlements. Here you can see this one, but that one's gone. That one's gone because it's part of a much larger municipality, and so the density drops. Well, we had a discussion with Mongolia. They were very worried that this method would not classify their capital, Ulaanbaatar, as a city. And it's a very dense city, and it's a very large city. But the reason they were worried is Ulaanbaatar is part of a very large municipality. So the average density of that municipality is extremely low. But at the grid level, you can clearly see that city. So it's very important to look at the grid. And that's really what has allowed us to work with single threshold across the globe. Let's move on.
Sorry, how big is the grid?
The grid is 1 by 1 kilometer. So they're square, same shape everywhere, 1 by 1 kilometer. We settled on that because a lot of statistical offices were willing to produce that. There was a first grid in 2011 by 30 European countries at that level of detail. And also increasingly, you see more countries producing these kind of grids themselves. Some even go more detailed, but then typically not in the countryside. 1 kilometer is like the level that they're willing to do for the entire country. And so here, a couple of examples. We've got a grid cell in Lagos in Nigeria. We have a town here in Venezuela, and then we have a tiny little village in Myanmar. So that's that continuum of settlements. We don't just go urban, rural, but we go a city, we go a town, we go to a village. And then we use these to monitor access to services, not to have them defined by access to services. We can check how many towns have a hospital or primary school or secondary school. And the benefit is a country can apply this themselves relatively quickly. It's not expensive, it's not complicated, and it's actually super transparent. So they can also explain to their bosses roughly what it is. Now, let me try and explain it quickly. I don't want to go into too much detail, but we have 2 levels. We have cities, towns and semi-dense areas, and rural areas. That's what we call level 1, 3 classes, and that's where we produce most of the data. Eurostat, for example, produces 240 indicators by degree of urbanization level 1. But especially the rural community we need more differentiation here. This is where most of the land is. If you have 80, 90% of your land there, it doesn't give you a lot of detail. So the FAO did a test, we developed a definition of villages, and that works really well. And obviously towns and semi-dense, the name already says it, it's really 2 types of settlements or 2 types of areas. We split into 2. We have towns, dense or semi-dense, and suburban or peri-urban areas. How do we define that? Basically, there are 2 thresholds. One that we apply at the cell level, this is the minimum density threshold, and one we apply to the cluster of the cells, so the minimum population in those clustered cells. So let me give you a simple example of a city, an urban center. The cell has to be 1,500 inhabitants per square kilometer. And in the contiguous clustered cells, you need more than 50,000 inhabitants. And it works the same for the urban cluster, minimum density of 300, at least 5,000 in the clustered cells, and the remaining cells are rural. And it's a hierarchical classification because we can subdivide these 2 into dense towns or dense urban clusters, minimum 5,000, 1,500, semi-dense, at least 900, 2,500, etc. And these will become our villages, minimum density 300, minimum population 500. And then grid data, I think, is awesome. The difficulty is that there's not a lot of data for the grid. You can have geospatial data, but if you don't vote on a grid, right? You don't pay money out on a grid. So you need a unit that has more data. So typically we use a municipality, and then we classify that on where the majority of the population lives. So if your majority of your population lives in an urban center, you're at a city. The majority lives in a rural grid cell, you're in rural areas, and if not, you're in between, around the semi-dense. And we do the same for the subclasses. The majority is in a dense urban cluster or an urban center, you're a dense town, etc., etc. And that allows you then to classify not just grid cells like you see here, but also municipalities or census tracts or what have you there. And this is, for example, an example from France, Toulouse. You can see the city center. In yellow, you see the suburban, and brown, the 2 types of towns, and the dark green are the villages. And then we use this to classify the commune in France to get that differentiation. We've even named all the towns in Europe, and actually it was usually quite easy to find a name. If you looked on the map, there typically was a settlement there, and it had a name. Sometimes it had 2 names because 2 close combined settlements, but in general, people recognize these places. It wasn't something that we just invented, it wasn't an artifact, it was reflecting how they perceived the settlement structure. In Brazil, for example, they felt like the settlements were like pearls on a string because every settlement was typically on a cross of a road. So you see a major road, when it crosses another road, you get a little settlement. So that's what we spent time developing. And then together, the colleagues in the JRC, we estimated population grids for the entire world. every 5 years from 1975 to 2020. And this allowed us really to start doing a lot of estimations. And one of the things we wanted to do was to take a look. The UN gathers data on large cities or agglomerations, and we wanted to compare that to our cities. So we looked at the cities that we defined and looked at the data coming from the UN and compared it. For example, in Northern Africa, the UN says about 28% of their population lives in a large city. According to us, a little bit higher, 35, but quite similar. And if you look, sometimes our estimates are lower, sometimes their estimates are higher, but all very similar. There are two exceptions, and that's Northern America and Australia and New Zealand. The reason they're different is because they're reporting on a different concept. They're not reporting on cities, they're reporting on urban agglomerations. And the other aspect is that the suburbs in North America are very large. It's where the vast majority of the population actually lives. But that's why we are coming up with an estimate for the city, which is 30%. They come up with an estimate for the urban agglomeration, which is 60%. Really, it doubles the number of people. And that's why we get those two big discrepancies there. But here it becomes more interesting. So we said, okay, this, and the black line is the share reported in urban. So Northern Africa, about 50% lives in an urban area. What we show is that we think in Northern Africa, about 50% lives in cities. But all this, there are lots of people in towns and semi-dense areas which are not captured here. Now, and if you look, there's a pattern here. If you look, this is the Americas, this is Europe. You see that black line is close to the top of the orange bar, right? So here, I have a very expansive definition of urban. It includes the towns and the suburbs. Then if you look in Africa, here, it's on top of that blue line, with the exception of Southern Africa. So there, it's a much more narrow definition of urban. They say, we're really talking about cities. We're not talking about towns or suburbs. Asia, also mostly talking about cities, much less about towns and semi-dense. So these black lines is what the UN reports, but these black lines are very different in meaning from one place to the next. Here I show level 2, and you can see, for example, here in Asia that the towns are partially urban, with the exception of here, that's India mostly. But we see quite a few of the dense towns are considered urban. Whereas in Europe and the Americas, even some of the villages are classified as urban. So from that, we could derive what does the urban definition resemble the most? And so if you're green, like US or Brazil, it means that your definition is expansive, very broad. It includes cities, towns, semi-dense, even some villages. If it's yellow, you include cities, towns, and semi-dense. You see lots of Europe, some parts of Central America. If you're red, it's only cities that it resembles. And so large parts of Africa, but not all. And then, of course, India and Pakistan, Indonesia, who have a very narrow definition of the urban area. Now, up until now, what I've shown you are pairwise comparisons, right? Share in urban, share in cities. But we didn't intersect them. We weren't able to say if these were the same places we're talking about. So what we've done next is we've tried to overlap these definitions. So we would look at a city and check, is it classified as urban? Look at rural, is it also classified as rural by the other definition? And then you get this result. Quickly explain the color coding. Dark green means it's rural in both. Light green means it's urban in national, but rural by the degree of urbanization. Doesn't happen a lot. Dark blue means it's urban and it's city. Light blue means it's a city, but it's classified as rural by the national definition. Towns are semi-dense, dark urban, light it's rural. Now, what do we see? We look again we start with Europe, cities, almost 100% urban. Towns and semi-dense, 90% urban. There's a little bit here in the light green that is classified as rural by the degree of urbanization, but classified as urban by the national definition. But overall, if you look here, this is the global, this happens very rarely. And also here, what is classified as a city is almost always classified as urban. It's rare for it to be classified otherwise. But what do we see when it comes to the brown colors? Here we see the big disagreement, right? We see that towns and semi-dense areas are really clearly urban in Europe and the Americas, and they are mostly rural in Asia and Africa. There are exceptions, but the overall pattern is very clear. But that gets problematic, and I'll get to that later, if you're expecting national definitions here to start resembling national definitions there. Here I've zoomed in on the towns and semi-dense and even split them up between the towns and the suburban peri-urban, and you see the same pattern. You know, the dark brown is town and urban, and in Europe and the Americas, almost all the population in a town is considered urban. Here in Asia and Africa, a minority of the population in a town is considered urban, and almost all of the population in peri-urban is considered rural. Whereas here, even in the suburban category, a lot of it is entirely urban or highly urban, according to the national definition. So why does this matter? The UN came out with a database time series on urban population starting in the 50s, and they wanted a projection for 2050. And they said between 2020 and 2050, we're going to see an increase in the urban population of more than 2 billion. That's more than 20% of the global population is going to become urban over the next 30 years. That was the big headline figure. We checked, and we also did some projections using the degree of urbanization. We came to almost half, 1.2 billion in cities over the next 30 years. It's still a lot, but it's half, right? We saw a slight increase in towns and semi-dense, but it really doesn't add up to anywhere near to that. On top of that, here I'm just giving you the global figures. The country by country distribution is even crazier because, for example, India tells the UN it's 32% urban. It's incredibly low. And the reason it's so low is because they have a very restricted definition of urban. You really need to be a very large density for them to grudgingly acknowledge that you're urban. The difficulty with national definitions is also they use it for policy. They use it to distribute funding, change tax rates, change subsidies. So it gets tied into money. And as soon as something gets tied into money, people have an incentive to either be one or the other. In India, it's quite beneficial to be rural. Your inhabitants get subsidies, you pay less taxes, and so there's a big resistance to becoming urban. And so that also explains why India says it's only 32% urban. And so that in and of itself explains a large chunk of why you see this big difference. And the initial work with the UN was based, assuming that national definitions were different, but not that different, right? And it's only by having an external benchmark that we could show how different these really are. If you would estimate the population in cities, towns, and semi-dense areas in India, you would end up 75% or more. So really, that's double the rate that they report. So these are big differences for one of the largest countries in the world. Oops, wrong direction. So cities tend to grow in population, but also in space. And we've seen big increases in city population over time. We expect more increases. We kind of disagree on how much, but still, let's take a look at some estimates of how much land would become urban. So Solly Angel at NYU came up with an estimate, and he said between 500,000 to 2.5 million, 2.5 million square kilometers would become urban over 50 years. That's a substantial increase. And he starts at about 600,000, 2,000. You do the same, we start at 400,000. So that's 2/3 of what he starts at. And we double, whether he doubles or quintuples. So again, having a harmonized definition and having a clear understanding what this means spatially is really important to understand how much more land are we going to need. And this figure is incredibly important for development aid, for investments in infrastructure, for preparing for urban expansion. The difference here depends on how density changes. He has a couple of simple scenarios. Densities stay the same, or they shrink a little bit, or they shrink a lot. What we've actually projected is a varying. Some cities become denser, some cities de-densify, depending on local conditions and growth rates. It's important to make these projections because we're going to be investing a lot in infrastructure, especially in Africa, where we're still going to see substantial population growth and urban growth. But it's important to get figures that are at least roughly right. Now, I talked about a people-based definition. And why is that so important? I think it's important because if you start from buildings, you're going to bias your analysis. So this is a very simple plot. You've got built-up surface per capita per person in square meters on the vertical axis, and then you got a logarithmic axis of GDP per capita in 2020. You can see here clearly linear trend, well, exponential trend up. Rich countries build more per capita. They live in bigger houses, they have bigger offices, they have bigger universities, they have bigger warehouses. So clearly, if you're interested in the relationship between urbanization and economic development, using a definition that uses built-up surface is going to lead to a much stronger relationship in terms of urban development, economic development. So this is the same graph on the horizontal axis, logarithmic GDP per capita 2020. But on the vertical, we have three different definitions of urban. This is the national definition of urban agglomerations. These are the cities of the degree of urbanization, and these are Solly Angel's urban extents. Hope you can see that a little bit. The interesting thing is that we all show a positive relationship, right? More developed countries are more urban in all three definitions, but the slope here is flatter than there, and this is the steepest one. The amount of variation we explain is lowest here, intermediate, and highest there. But the reason it's so high here is because this definition is based on built-up area. And here, actually, if we wanted to explain development, the best thing we would do is explain it by buildings. Of course, the relationship is not causal. It's not because we have buildings we're rich. It's because we're rich we have a lot of buildings. But if you use this kind of information to define your cities, and here, we explain 37% of the variation we observe here. This is all national level data. So in terms of correlations, this is the best one. All these are inferior. But the reason this one is better than that one or that one is because it has a built-in bias that makes rich countries more urban and poor countries less urban. But so this also leads to very optimistic assumptions that if only we were a bit more urban, we would be so much richer. Whereas in actual fact, it's much flatter and it explains far less of that variation than we see there. So in the last bit of my presentation, I want to talk a little bit about how cities grow and what drives that. Now, I have some time for audience participation. What explains population growth in cities? A couple of factors.
I don't know, the amount of people who is I don't know. Let's see. The control of natality, maybe.
Yes, natural natality, birth rates, they contribute to city growth. What's the other one?
In migration of workers.
In migration is the second one. There's a third one, which people usually ignore. Anybody willing to venture a guess? If it's not natural change, if it's not migration, how can you still have more people in your city?
Is it conflict in other regions?
No, that would still lead to migration.
Putting two settlements together and calling it the city.
Exactly, yes. It's called reclassification. And that's really it's an old problem. There was a paper done in 1965, so a long time ago, that said there are three components to city population: natural change, birth minus death, net migration, in minus out, and reclassification. It was a great paper, but it was never able to quantify how important these three elements were. Conceptually very clear, but you need very detailed data to be able to do so. Here we have a map of Cairo. In blue, you see the parts that were a city in 1980, and then in the dotted line, you see how much bigger that city became 40 years later. And so in these green areas, you're going to have a lot of people that were already there, but they became part of that city. There's been some growth, and all of a sudden it reached the density threshold, so it was part of that city. But a lot of the people were already there. So this is another example. This is Shanghai. Big spatial growth. You see different separate little cities being agglomerated in there. And so typically what you would get in the UN data is they don't have boundaries. If you're lucky, they have a centroid. If you're really lucky, it's in the right spot. And so they would initially give you the data for 1980 for this boundary, right? They would ignore all the other cities. And then in 2020, you would get the population for that boundary. So you get two numbers, and how do you understand what's contributing to that? And so if you ignore reclassification, then only the people in that blue bit are allowed to have natural change. And all the people who were already there or arrived there in the meantime are considered as, are not allowed to have babies. They're also not allowed to die. So it underestimates natural change by artificially limiting the population that we consider. Because obviously the people there in this boundary, a lot of them were already there in 1980. And so because we underestimate natural change, we're going to overestimate net migration. So there's different types of reclassification. You can have annexation, when you grab a neighboring town or suburb and add it to a city. You can have a town that becomes a new city, so that's a different type. And we see a lot of both. We have a big increase in the number of cities, increases by roughly 5,000, but most of them are very small, right? You'll have a town of 40,000 that becomes a city of 60,000. But a lot of people, 1 in 6 today, lived in a city that wasn't there yet in 1980. So the reason that we're doing this now is because we have boundaries for each of those different periods, and we have population for all those steps in time, which is something the UN doesn't have, so you couldn't do it at that point in time. Yeah, we have, oops. Basically, the problems with the UN data, no boundaries. You don't know where, how large the area is, and you don't know how it has changed. You get a centroid, and sometimes it's not just the boundaries, but also the underlying definition. So what we can do now is we have boundaries. We keep the definition constant, but we allow the boundaries to change over time. Yeah. The tricky thing we still need to do is, even if we have the city boundaries, we have a time series of population, we still need to figure out the natural change rate, the net migration rate in cities versus the rest of the country. This is a bit difficult. We have made a number of assumptions. The first one, natural change is the same in the entire country. That's actually close to true in a lot of European countries. Natural change doesn't differ much between urban and rural. If anything, it's slightly higher in urban than in rural. But of course, in Africa, it's still much higher in rural. So we have another extreme scenario where it's 15% higher in rural as compared to towns and 50% lower in cities as compared to towns. And then we have a last method that we use to impute based on a regression taking into account the population with primary education only. Why do we use that indicator? Households with very little education or moms with very little education are more likely to have a large number of children. So it's a very robust regression. We use urban and rural birth and death rates from the United Nations database, URPAS, and with that, we kind of estimate natural change by degree of urbanization. Now, why does this matter? So this is, we look at, say, the different income groups. So there's low, middle, and high income groups. We have the different components. Reclassification is on top. We've got international migration in orange at the bottom, people leaving low and middle income countries, moving to high income countries. We have a bit of internal migration if there's no difference in natural, so yeah, maybe I explained this. So these are the three types of natural change that we have estimated. So here, no difference, imputed difference, the 15% difference. And so in low income countries, if we assume that natural change is identical across the entire country, we see that internal migration does not contribute to city population growth. It's only when we assume that it's significantly higher in rural areas that we see migration contributing somewhat to city population growth. But the overall message is no matter what assumption we take, in all cases, the majority of population growth is coming from natural change. It is not net migration. Net migration, the combination of these two, actually contributes relatively little. In high income countries, you get actually a quite nice pattern in the sense that you see that international migration contributes positively to city population growth, whereas internal migration detracts. So Brussels, where I used to live, typically would have a lot of people born in Belgium moving out of Brussels and people born outside of Belgium moving into Brussels. So this is, say, the suburbanization of the locals, and this is the arrivals of the foreigners, if you will. And again, the natural change has a little bit of impact here, but if you look at the second biggest impact here, and it's roughly the same in all the scenarios in all the three income classes, reclassification is roughly 30% of city population growth. That's big. It's the second biggest factor, much bigger than migration in any of these. Here, we show one decision that we have to take. We have to decide when do we take into account reclassification. So if you have a 40-year time period, you can say, okay, we'll take it into account at the start. But that's maybe a bit unfair because it might still take 20 or 30 years before that area becomes part of a city. You can take it at the end in 2020, but then it's already city. So that's also not very fair. So the best thing to do is to take it right before or right after it became a city. And then you see that the impact of internal and international migration is relatively small. It's around 4%. Reclassification is 29%, and 2/3 of the growth is coming from natural change. Whereas what people typically do They only look at the population natural change from the original population in 1980. You get 51%, and the rest is net migration. So default assumption is globally 49% of city population growth is due to net migration. In actual fact, we think it's about 4%. So that's a massive difference. Now, why does that matter? Some countries have quite active policies to try and prevent city population growth or to promote city population growth. What we're learning here is that really the factor that's going to determine the most of your population growth in cities is your natural change. Focusing on migration, like China has done with the hukou system, isn't going to make a huge difference because it's mostly drawn by that and that. So this is why making sure you understand why your cities are bigger, getting bigger, really changes what you can do in terms of policies to either support that or try and slow that down. Here, I've shown it by different world regions. I quite like to show it because here we take a little bit more of different assumptions about where they go and where they come from. We can assume that they come from all over the place in a country and that they go all over the place in another country, but it's not really true. Definitely in terms of destinations in Northern America, Oceania, and Europe, international migrants are far more likely to move to a city. So the share of foreign-born population in a city is 3 times higher than in a rural area. So it's more appropriate to assume that at least in Northern America and Europe, and Oceania, international migrants will move to the city. And then if you assume that, you see that impact really jumping out, that international migration contributes more, whereas internal migration becomes strongly negative. What does this do in Latin America, Africa, Asia? First of all, it doesn't do very much because yes, they have some out-migration, but not so much. What it becomes if you assume that people are more likely to leave for another country from a city, you see that international migration becomes a little bit more negative and you get a slightly more positive internal migration impact on your city population growth. If you look at Asia, very small differences, -2% for international, 4% for internal. But if you think of China trying to reduce internal migration, it's not going to have much impact on their city sizes, right? Because it's all driven. So, trying to convince you that reclassification is important. I'm glad that you realize that there was another factor there. And this is really the first time we've been able to do this in such a detailed manner globally. And I think that's really important. Because if you only look at natural change and net migration, you think, that natural change is not that important. You're going to say it's half of the growth, where in reality, you think it's 2/3. Reclassification at 29 goes entirely to net migration. And so you get that 49 instead of that 4%. And that really is dramatic in terms of difference of impact and also very important for the policy. If we have higher natural change in rural areas, we do get a bit more impact of net migration, particularly within the country, especially in Africa and Asia. Concentrating internal migration in cities, especially in high-income countries, you see positive impact in international and negative impact internal. So, leaving ample time for questions, let me try and wrap up. I think national definitions roughly agree that big cities are urban. We don't know where they are, they're quite easy to find. We might disagree on where to draw the boundary, but overall, we agree large agglomerations are urban, and all the definitions find those places. It's at the town level that we start to disagree, and national definitions either classify them as partially urban, or entirely rural. And that leads to, in global projections, complete overestimation of growth in city land and city population growth. And really, we're now working with the UN. They're going to publish their new projections in October this year, and that will include both our projections and heavily modified projections using national definitions. They will no longer assume that those national definitions are the same, and no longer assume that these countries will converge over the long term. So we will get much more moderate increases in urbanization in India because they acknowledge that it's a much more conservative definition of urban. So we should get a lot better there, but there's still people working with this data, and I'd like to make sure that we use better data and a more harmonized definition. On economic growth, I want to look into this a little bit more. Right now, I think if you use a building-based definition, you're going to overestimate the impact of urbanization on economic development. But there's one thing that I'm still a little bit frustrated with and hope to fix. We have a definition of cities, but we don't have a definition of an agglomeration. So we don't have a definition of city plus suburb. We now have a draft out that we should publish soon, where we actually are identifying which suburb belongs to which city, which is particularly important for places in North America where half the urban city agglomeration population lives in the suburb. Once we have that, I think we will also be able to check whether that definition of agglomeration works better for economic development, but I'm not expecting major changes there. And then, yeah, I just said it, ignoring reclassification leads to a massive overestimation of the impact of migration. Oh, that was my story. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Lewis. So now questions from the audience. Yes, please go ahead. Say your name and
Oh, I'm Gabby. And I was just wondering, how do you know that the HUCO system has not had an impact, considering that the HUCO system came out before all of the data for these statistics was collected? I think the HUCO system was introduced in like the 50s, finalized in like how it is now in the 80s, like right in the beginning and before even the major urban development in China. So how do you know that it doesn't have an impact and that it's all internal, because it's been working this way for so long?
So I'm not saying the HUCO system didn't have an impact, but I'm saying that because it is trying to address a very small source of city population growth, its possible impact can only be very, very small. So if half the population, city population growth in China came from net migration, if you're able to reduce, say you reduce it by 20%, you'd have a big impact on city population growth. If 4% of your city population growth is coming from net migration, then reducing net migration by 10%, okay, you just reduced it by 0.4%. The scale, the impact of net migration in terms of scale is very small. So modulating that will not have a big impact. I expect the HUCO system to have slowed down migration to cities. They created a massive disincentive. You didn't get the services, you know, etc. But it wasn't attacking the main driver of city population. So I think it wasn't a very smart policy, and I do think it slowed things down, but only slowed down a very small aspect.
more questions? No, I do have quite a few questions on my side. The first one is, I mean, about the implications of the definitions of cities, and in light of development policies. We have, and many of my students are learning that there have been two confronting sort of models: the spatially blind sort of approach promoted by the World Bank, and the place-based approach mainly developed by the European Union or applied by the European Union and the OECD. The spatially blind is normally a policy that suggests that you should invest in your biggest assets, which is mainly your cities, and therefore, after you have that development in the cities, you create a motor of economic development. This is going to spread out to the rest of the country. You come with a degree of urbanization. It turns out that we have everywhere, and especially in the developed countries, that cities are, or urban areas are smaller. And they are, and that the connection to economic growth is small as a result of that. So 2 questions here. The first one is, to what extent is then this idea that cities are the motors of economic growth a reality or a myth? And what is the implications for policies? Should we still try to aim for, let's say, spatially blind policies that mainly end up favoring the big cities, or should we do other things and spread out more of the efforts to other parts of the countries?
Let me start by the spatially blind. The World Bank argument starts from a plausible story. It starts from the story that some places, some small places, are not so popular. They take various examples, but they've taken an example of like a small mining town that was there in the 1900s or 1800s and then disappeared, right? Some places disappear. And then they use that to say, this is true of all places. And there they make a leap in terms of scale, which is completely implausible. They take the disappearance of a small mining town of maybe 10,000 people and say a region of 5 million can disappear. And we shouldn't assume that regions are permanent and that the population is there permanently. So I think they make a scale mistake. I know it's inevitable that some settlements won't be there in 20 or 30 years, especially in countries with a lot of reduction in their population. And we would be foolish to try and save all of them. But that doesn't mean that we can't make sure that all our regions, which have a lot of population in them, can contribute to growth. I do think there are clear reasons why we have overestimated the impact of urbanization on growth. If you look at growth in Europe at the metropolitan level, most of the metropolitan areas grow more slowly than the non-metropolitan areas. So we actually have higher growth outside the metropolitan areas. The only consistent exception is the capital. So I actually think a spatially blind policy that overinvests in their cities and the capital and underinvests in the rest of the country is a very poor strategy for growth. Both based on, say, historic trends of where growth has located, but also in terms of potential of where growth could continue to happen. So I do think that we have oversimplified the narrative. We have made a mistake, or the advocates of a spatially blind policy have simplified things too far, assuming that every single region can completely empty out, and that it's always better to put your money in the largest settlements. So I am very much supportive of a much more dispersed development model. And I think the trends in Europe over the past decade show that there is a lot of potential for dispersed growth. And that's not necessarily only of the catching up variety. Also, we can see a dispersion of innovation and in productivity growth as well. But it really depends on where policies are focused on. It depends on our policy narrative, but it also depends on where we put our investments, right? And so there, I definitely think that even though London is lovely, investing only in London is a horrible idea.
Okay. More questions? Yes, go ahead, Carolina.
A small one is like, we talk about reclassification as, I don't know, when the boundaries are just getting bigger.
Yeah.
But for example, in my city, we had this kind of become a metropolitan area and people need to vote for that, but people say no, because we're gonna lose like political control for our areas. And there start a big discussion, so we don't know if we have them in the city or not.
Mm-hmm.
So could you please explain me a little bit more about this concept and when we can say that we are in a process of reclassification or not?
Sure. Let me start with the definition of a city. Really, what needs to change is you need to live in an area which reaches a density of 1,500 inhabitants per square kilometer, and it needs to be contiguous with other areas that have reached that density threshold. So, where are you from?
Cali, in Colombia.
And that you can actually monitor over time. You can also see it if you see that, you know, there are more buildings and those buildings are contiguous, then you would say, okay, this becomes part of the city. But there is another part, you mentioned metropolitan area. We have a definition of metropolitan area, which is you take that city and then you add the commuting zone. These are all the areas where 15% of the people who are working actually commute to that city. So that's another way that you can become part of a city or part of a metropolitan area. This really requires good data on commuting. This typically only comes out once every decade with the census, but that would be another way. If you are part of a contiguous set of municipalities that have 15% of their population working in the city, you would be considered part of the commuting zone. And this is a definition we developed together with the OECD, so principle that should also be applied to your country. And that is one way of looking at these changes over time. What we try and advocate for is that this is a useful tool to allow you to compare your city with another city in another OECD country or elsewhere in the world. We don't necessarily think that designing metropolitan governance has to happen exactly for that definition. That's not what it's designed for. It's designed to make statistics comparable across space. Having said that, the OECD does have a lot of discussions about governance fragmentation. If you have a metropolitan area that has a lot of different municipalities in there, each with their own little council, their own little budgets, their own little decisions, it becomes much harder to create an efficient governance mechanism, right? We're not saying these municipalities have to disappear, but if you want to have a good plan for public transport, infrastructure investment, land use plans, it is much better to organize this at the metropolitan scale rather than the individual city scale. And I can mention numerous places in Europe that absolutely fail on that front, where the plans are a total mess. So it is important advice. It's difficult to always accept it or implement it, but it would allow for much better city planning and city development at scale. But what I have noticed on working on urban and rural definitions and metropolitan definitions is that these things touch a nerve. People become very, maybe emotional is the wrong word, but they're very attached to certain classifications of their place. They identify that place and they identify with that place as being either a town or being urban, or on the contrary, being rural, and really disliking the idea that it would be something else. So I have quite often seen these discussions raised to very strong responses in the audience, and that can even be among statisticians. Sometimes you get a very emotive response to a discussion about technical definitions and classification. But I do think it's important to consider also how the population perceives its territory and where they want to be part of and what they see. But it's also important to explain to them the relationships that you may not see. The commuting that's happening there and the commuting you want to facilitate. That's an important aspect to consider. And so where there are strong flows between places, it is useful to have some kind of governance at that level that captures all those commuting flows. Hope that's helpful.
Thank you.
Yes, Joanna?
Yeah. My question is very related to this complex relation between self-determination. So what are the implications of adopting like a standard definition for national self-determination, and especially concerning local communities in rural areas? How do you deal, or do you do a risk analysis about this kind of problem?
This is a carefully politically crafted text. I want to underline a little bit, while emphasizing that the methodology is not intended to replace national definitions of urban and rural areas, but to complement. That is there exactly because a lot of people feel very proprietary of their communities and of the definitions that have been in place for a long time. So here we really are not asking countries to ditch their own definitions, but we're encouraging to add this one if they want to do statistical comparisons. So we really want to respect that. What I like about this definition is that it can help look inside larger municipalities. If you have a very large municipality, it might have a very large population. It might live in one big city. It might live in a few towns. It might live in hundreds of little villages. You don't know unless you can look inside. And so for me, the fact that we use the grid really allows you to get a better grasp of how the population is structured inside a municipality. And it can help them think through or see that that reality represented, which otherwise a definition would fail to do. But one of the things that we always do with a degree of urbanization is there's a purely statistical component to it, but then we present the results to stakeholders and they can say, well, actually this bit, your definition doesn't capture it, but it really belongs to this city. So there are limited opportunities, but they are there to adjust the definition to better reflect local reality. And so in some cases they'll say, oh, well, this municipality, the town population is a little bit too low to hit the 50%, but we really identify as the town, and I don't think you can cover the entire town. So then they say, we want this municipality to be classified as a town. This is laborious, but I think it improves the end result. And just to give an example, Eurostat right now is negotiating the new degree of urbanization based on the census data. And so that means you have a classification of 100,000 municipalities. And you ask all the countries concerned, are you happy with this? Do you see any need for changes? And they changed about 1,400 municipalities. So there are manual adjustments to about 1% of all the municipalities to improve that local connection and improve that local reality. But maybe one last comment there. I am a bit skeptical of very small municipalities. I do worry that they lack enough staff, enough expertise, enough budget to really help their citizens and their residents. I do also worry it's more expensive to provide services at that small scale. And then what you see happening in France, which has lots of tiny municipalities, is that actually the services are provided for a conglomeration of municipalities, but you can't vote for that conglomeration, right? So actually, when the services start being provided at a different scale than you're voting for, I feel there's a disconnect there, which is unfortunate. And so either you provide services for that municipality, or you make the municipality big enough so that they can provide those services. And also from a democratic point of view, if you live in a municipality of 500 people, there's not going to be that much choice on who's going to be the mayor. And I like choice, right? I like a little bit of competition. So sometimes having a bit more choice is not such a bad thing. But again, a lot of people are very strongly attached to the historic boundaries of the municipality, and they're terrified of any changes. And also, especially if those changes happen in the context of a drinking population, then more difficult for people to accept.
Yes, Asai.
Yeah, I was just wondering if it can be assumed that India's urbanization is around 30%. Is it because reclassification, or like metropolitan cities like Mumbai, where it just gets difficult to measure the rate? Yeah.
So the 32% is what India reports for its census year in 2011 to the UN. And that's based on the census definition. And that one has a lot of restrictions on when you can be urban. One of the restrictions is you can't have a lot of employment in agriculture. So because of that definition, a lot of towns, even though they have the size and the density to actually be considered urban, are classified as rural. There have been some estimates that if you would take out that single requirement of not having too much people working on farms, you could almost double the urbanization rate of India. So go from like 32 to over 60. So that shows you how important small details are in the definition. What we have found is that we have definitely found I think it's 35% of the population of India lives in a city of at least 50,000 inhabitants, but many live in smaller towns or what we call peri-urban areas. So not very low density, but moderate density. That might be primarily active in agriculture, but they have a concentration of population that is significantly higher than in more dispersed rural areas. So I've met a couple of times with different parts of the Indian statistical system to discuss these topics. When I said that we estimated their urban population to be over 70, they were like, whoa, that's quite a lot. And this is where the benefit is of having multiple classes, right? We're not trying to say India is 75% urban. We're trying to say, hey, it's probably 35% in cities, there's probably another 30–40% in towns and semi-dense areas, and the rest is very clearly rural. We've also done a comparison, and at the extremes, the two definitions completely agree. Everything the degree of urbanization classifies as rural, India classifies as rural. Okay, it's not so hard if you have almost 70% classified as rural, but everything that we define as cities, they define as urban, and it's just that stuff in the middle where the disagreement lies. But having a continuum allows you to isolate that disagreement between national definitions and create a different category. It's also important to have multiple categories, because if you start looking at what characterizes towns, they're different from cities and they're different from rural areas. So if you look at income, if you look at employment, look at education, they have a different profile there, typically in between. But on some topics, you actually see that there are more. You see, for example, a lot of construction happening in those towns and semi-dense areas, more so than in the cities, because the cities are already heavily built up. So it's useful to have these multiple categories to get a better understanding of what's happening. And the dichotomy is, well, it's not black and white. Useful to have more color.
Any other questions? Yes, go ahead.
Will the reclassification of the city aggravates inequality? Like, if I understand it correctly, one of the drivers of reclassification is because of the limited land use in city. So if the local authorities want to build some of the factories, they will incorporate the towns to become the city. So, it results that a lot of people will go to the core regions to work and leaving the towns to be empty. So,
how to answer that one?
Good question.
Yeah. Let me start with the inequality one. The shape of a city and the expanse of a city doesn't necessarily have a direct relationship with inequality. You could have a city expanding a lot and becoming more equal. You can have a city expanding a lot and becoming more unequal. I think they're relatively independent processes. Reclassification will mean that people live in a denser environment that they were in the past. It could mean that the people who own land or property there, that it becomes more valuable over time. If they were poor, that will reduce inequality. If they were already rich, then it will increase inequality. So there's not a clear answer there. The difficulty is a little bit when we start to look at the differences between multiple settlements, right? And when you see migration going from one side to the other, and typically that's always presented as a zero-sum game. The loss of one place is the gain of another. That's quite difficult, and I think it's not necessarily the best way to present that. What we see in Europe is that we see, on average, rural areas are shrinking, but they're not shrinking because of out-migration. They're primarily shrinking because of negative natural change. And I think of migration also not as something that's necessarily good. There's a life cycle component to it. If you look in Europe, you see young people move to the city, like London. Once they're middle-aged and have kids, they might move out to the suburbs. Once they retire, they might move to the countryside. So you have to think of that as a path that can happen. People can also change their mind. Maybe old people in the future will want to live in downtown, in the city center. So I don't think migration is a zero-sum game. I don't think it necessarily makes the places where people leave worse off, and doesn't necessarily make the places where they arrive better off. There are a lot of different interactions there. But I also think movement creates links. What we see in Europe is a lot of people have left places like Romania, Bulgaria, and Poland. But as a result, they have found better paying jobs elsewhere, and they're sending a lot of money. It's also mean that there are unemployment rates typically are lower if a lot of people leave a place because there's only fewer people. You'd have to have a very big reduction in employment as well as at the same time to maintain the same unemployment rate. So I think it can be beneficial. There are places, small places, where at a certain point you lose critical mass, right? So if you're a very small village, worked kind of okay when you were, 300 people, but once you're down to 100 or 50, there is, all the local amenities kind of disappear and you're just a lump of housing with an aging population. So there are tipping points from which it's hard to recover. But in aggregate, for larger places, I represent an organization that fought for the freedom of movement. I still quite like it. I'm continuing to defend it. So I don't think migration necessarily has automatic winners and losers. It really depends on the context, on where they go, and if they can go back. The benefit of the freedom of movement in Europe is that it's free both ways. So you're free to leave, but you're also free to go back. And that makes it much more responsive. And you see countries that have gone from out-migration countries to in-migration countries. Historically, Ireland is a very good example. That used to have a massive out-migration and now it's extremely popular for in-migration. But even some of the Baltic states have gone from out-migration to in-migration. So don't think of the current situation as your destiny. Think of it as something that's dynamic and can change, but that it creates opportunities and relations. Bit of a long answer to a good question, but I hope it was helpful.
Thank you very much. Last question from me, unless there's anyone else. You mentioned in different parts of your intervention and in the answers, 3 topics. The first, that this idea that, which is widespread, that big cities are magnets because they offer opportunity. So everyone wants to move to big cities. And that the planning system is not up to scratch, is not capable of coping with that movement. And that creates massive conflict. Yet, then you do the analysis and you find they're not that much of a magnet. It's mainly reclassification and especially internal growth. Second, your projection of growth of cities in the built environment is 400,000 square kilometers, which is 1/4 of the land surface area. So should we be worried? Is the whole debate that we're having about the conflict about access to housing such a reality? Or are we going to be needing, let's say, less housing, less problems, and our planning system is capable of coping with it as it is?
So the figures I presented were for all cities
Yeah.
combined, large and small. The impact of reclassification and of net migration differs along sizes, and it also differs substantially between countries which have very high demographic growth and ones that don't. In the figures that I showed, I showed the contribution to growth, but I didn't show the absolute growth, right? So you see, okay, 1/3 or 2/3 is determined by natural change, but if your natural change is nothing, then well, it's 2/3 of nothing, right? If your natural change is actually shrinking, then obviously it's not going to contribute much to urbanization. So the situation in places like Europe, where the population is barely growing, in many regions it's already shrinking and it's projected to shrink in the future, we are confronted with a very different situation. But one of the mistakes is actually to think as the main driver of demand for housing, to think of it as demographic. A lot of it is actually economic, and it's not purely total population, it's the number of households that matters. We are seeing in many places a reduction in population, but a growth in the number of households, because you get more one-person households, you get smaller families. So even with a smaller population, you may actually need more dwellings, but maybe smaller ones, right? So I do think that we have in Europe quite a challenge in changing the composition of our housing stock, but also changing its location. The difficulty with looking in the long term is that there are fashions. If you look at, say, 60, 70 years of city population change within a city, you'll see that at a certain point, it was very unfashionable to live downtown. And then all of a sudden it became incredibly fashionable, at least in some cities. So if you look at London, you know, in the 60s and the 70s, it was shrinking. Brussels, it was shrinking in the 80s, even in the 90s. And then all of a sudden people said, you know, these suburbs, they really are boring. And then all of a sudden it became trendy to live in the city center. At a certain point, it was dirt cheap to live in the city center, and now it's incredibly expensive. So there are clearly cycles that aren't, you know, that can change sign over time. But when it comes to the planning system, I think there are two different aspects here. One is situations in Africa where you see rapid natural change, rapid demographic change, big growth in cities, and very little planning capacity to deal with it, right? And most of those additional square kilometers of city land are going to be in Africa, because it's going to be the only continent that's still growing in terms of population in the future. And so that's going to generate a huge demand for additional investment. And even though I disagree with the scale that some researchers have put out there, I definitely think that for Africa is going to be a massive challenge to accommodate all that new population in areas where, you know, you provide at least the basic services to them. We have evidence that in some countries, as the country became more urban in Africa, the share of urban residents with access to water, piped water, dropped, because the growth was so rapid that they couldn't keep up providing that infrastructure. A lot of them ended up living in informal settlements where there was just no access to water provided. So there we have a massive challenge to the planning system in terms of capacity to deliver the infrastructure and the services to rapid urban growth. We're not talking sprawl. Even if the density stays high as it is now, it's still going to rapidly expand. If we look in Europe, the demographic pressure is much lower, but there's also an economic component to it. And we have ended up creating a lot of unnecessary scarcity in many of the popular cities. And that has a double impact. And I really worry about this because it exacerbates inequalities. How does artificial scarcity of housing exacerbate inequality? First of all, it makes the rich richer, because if you own a house, it becomes far more valuable without you having to do anything other than just not destroy it. So you get a lot of unearned wealth to the rich. The poor people don't own property and have to pay more and more rent because housing is expensive. So that's the first way it exacerbates inequality. The second way it exacerbates inequality is it generates a massive income transfer from the young to the old, from the renters to the property owners. And that again exacerbates inequality. And it could even have political impacts. Young people in countries where it's very difficult to find housing for themselves are less satisfied with democracy, more inclined to vote for populist parties. So do we have a housing problem in Europe? Yes. Does the planning system need to think about this in a different way? Yes. Is the market going to solve everything once we release planning restrictions? No. So it's not a diatribe against planning as such. I'm a planner by training, but I do think by giving a lot of localities control about how much gets built, far less gets built and not enough gets built. And the richer the municipalities, the more control and restrictions they create or invent to limit the amount of construction in those areas. And so we artificially reduce supply. It benefits the people who already own a large property, but I really hope that we find a way, and in part this will have to be by constructing social or public housing, as well as producing more privately owned dwellings, because I worry about the political and the inequality impacts of the current situation. So the fact that we have empty housing in one part of the country doesn't solve the problem in Barcelona or Madrid or Brussels for that matter. And what used to be a problem in a few small number of countries seems to become ever and ever more pervasive. Part of that is because these countries have become more affluent and so they're more able to pay for housing, but not everybody has become more affluent. And everybody still needs a place to live.
No, thank you very much for let's wrap it up. Thank you very much for coming, and to those of you that have followed the presentation online, there will be through the Cañada Blanca Center here at the LSE a lot of new events. We have just, I'm sorry to ask you that you were actually whetting our appetite, but the main course would be on Monday. We have the Executive Vice President of the European Commission, Teresa Rivera, who is coming at 6:30. So please register. That one is ticketed, so you'll have to join. You can also follow online if you want. And we'll have 3 more events during the month of March. So please follow us, stay tuned either on LinkedIn or on X. Remember, it's the Cañada Blanca Center here at the LSE. Thank you very much.